Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nazir daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Terry Kravosha for the Refuah Shlema of her husband, Rav Chaim Yehuda ben Fega Riva, and their daughter Tamar Davida bat Saraleh. We're going to have a very, very fascinating daf, and this is a good example of when you learn something out of context, or this happens in the news all the time. You take a sentence out of context and you explain it as if to mean something, and you think that's the whole picture, and then you realize you're missing something major. Well, something we saw in Daf Kaf Aleph Amud, which seemed a little surprising. Today, we're going to learn the other side. So without more introduction, let's start the Mishnah, and you will see. We have a woman who becomes a Nazirah, and then she drinks wine, and then she becomes impure to dead. That's obviously forbidden. She gets lashes. Now, either this is just talking about a regular case, in which case it's really unnecessary. We had this at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud and then said, well, it's only necessary so that you understand the continuation. The other option was to say that what this is talking about is a woman who became a Nazirah, her husband nullified the vow. She became a Nazirah, she drank wine, then her husband nullified the vow. And we say Megas Gayis because she gets lashes, right? He only stops the Nazirut going from then on. It doesn't undo it from the beginning. If it did it from the beginning, then she wouldn't get lashes. So it's telling you she gets lashes because it's trying to tell you it's not erased from the beginning. Two ways to understand the beginning part of that Mishnah. The end part of our Mishnah is what's going to really interest us today. This was this crazy case. He nullifies the vow. She doesn't know that he nullifies it. She thought she was a Nazir. She continues to go against being a Nazir. Okay, she decides, I'm a Nazir, I don't really care. I'm going to drink wine. I'm going to become impure to dead people. Obviously, it means one or the other or both. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't have to be all of them. She doesn't get lashes. Now, there were some people in class who were very disturbed by this, who said, what do you mean? She did something wrong. She tried to sin. Well, that is our topic today, because what we didn't quote the other day is the end of that Mishnah, which is Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and this is when you take things out of context. It's very important to know that you're taking things out of context. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im enas sofeget et ha'arba'im tispog makat mardut. First, let's explain what makat mardut is. Makat mardut is lashes by the rabbis. The rabbis are allowed to decide you deserve lashes, even if you don't deserve it by Torah law. We're giving you lashes. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, you might not be able to get lashes, as for all the reasons we discussed when we saw this on Kaf Aleph Amud, which is you didn't actually do a ma'aseh avera. To get lashes, you have to have done a sin. You have to have been warned. If you do this sin, no one could have warned her, even if they did warn her. It wasn't true. She wasn't a Nazirah. So she can't get Torah lashes. But she thought she was doing a sin. So comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, you definitely have to punish her. You can't punish her by the Torah law, but you can punish her by rabbinic law. The rabbis have the rights to come in and say, okay, you're not deserving this punishment. We're going to give you our own punishment. What's interesting about Rabbi Yehuda now, there's two ways to read this Mishnah. Either Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Tanna Kama, and Tanna Kama says, right, classic structure of a Mishnah, right? If you wouldn't have read any commentaries, you would say, classic structure of a Mishnah, Tanna Kama thinks no, Rabbi Yehuda thinks yes, right? Tanna Kama thinks you don't get punished at all. But many of the commentaries, including the Rambam, think that Rabbi Yehuda is explaining the rabbis. The rabbis he's not disagreeing with them. He's saying, of course, everyone would agree with me that she gets lashes by the rabbis. And then it becomes not just Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, but everybody's opinion. It's just clear that this woman deserves lashes by rabbinic law because she was transgressing something. So that changes entirely the way we viewed this 2 days ago. So now we're going to start with, and the Gemara is going to all deal with fascinating topics such as intention to do an avera, okay, but not that you didn't actually do it, like our case, or no intention to do an avera, no intention to transgress, but you actually did, okay? And we're going to start with a braita that has 3 sections to it, and these 2 issues are going to be discussed, the second one in 2 different ways, okay? You'll see in a minute. Tanu Rabbanan, we're going to take 2 to 3 psukim, depending on your version. Our version has 2 different psukim. The first one is darshan to our case, and then the other 2 are darshan. The other one is darshaned in 2 different ways by 2 different people. Some people actually have, I'll just tell you this outside. I don't want to get into it today because there's too much other fascinating things. It's not so critical to our, but the third section of this braita, the pasuk is not actually the same pasuk. He darshans the third verse, but that I'm going to put aside. Tanu Rabbanit. So here's our braita. Isha teram v'Hashem yislach. This is a very weird pasuk in the section of Nidarim. Interestingly enough, in Masechet Nidarim, this didn't come up. You would have thought so. Anyway, the pasuk there says the husband will nullify her vow, and God will forgive her. Forgive her for what? Right? I mean, the simple reading maybe is forgive her that she made a vow in the first place, and she shouldn't have, and, the husband gets rid of it, and God will forgive her for having made the vow. But, it's not exactly clear from the Torah that making a vow is a sin, and that she needs atonement for it. Nobody really talked about, you made a neder. Yes, we talked about some good thing. You shouldn't do it. Do you need forgiveness? So this braita is going to darshan this in a different way. What is this talking about? That she will be forgiven. In a case where her husband nullifies it, when will she need forgiveness? Our Mishnah. It's talking about a woman whose husband nullified her vow. She didn't know, and she went against her vow. This pasuk is telling you she needs atonement. Hashem Yislacha doesn't mean she gets, immediate forgiveness by God. It means she needs to atone for the sin, even though it's not a sin, right? Now, this isn't by Torah law. There's a drasha from the Torah. It's there's a remez for this. Now, we get to the emotional part. Rabbi Akiva got to this pasuk, he would cry. Why? He says, now he brings a parallel case to our Mishnah. Now, our Mishnah is talking about a woman who thinks she's sinning, but it turns out she's not. He gives the following example. And he starts as a beginning of a comparison. And this is, you'll see in a minute what made him cry. You went into a restaurant thinking it was a non-kosher restaurant. You order a steak. And you think that you're eating pork. But it turned out you didn't realize that it was a kosher restaurant. Okay? And you end up eating kosher meat. Okay, this is the exact same thing. You think you're eating treif, but you're not. You need kapara uslicha, just like this woman. So now go back to the beginning. Uma. Uma means, and what if this person needs kapara? Rabbi Akiva looks around at his community and looks around at these intentional sinners and says, but if you intended to go into a non-kosher restaurant and you ate in that non-kosher restaurant pork, he says, wow, what atonement these people need, right? If you need atonement for not even actually doing something wrong, just the intent to do something wrong, think about how much worse it is when you both have the intent and you do the action. And for that, it made him cry, looking at his generation and all the sinners that were there. He continues to say, here's example 2. I told you 3 examples in this braita. Likewise, we say, Lo yadava Hashem v'nasavonim. Okay, the topic of this pasuk we're talking about, okay, let's go give some background. There's things that if you do intentionally, you get karet for them. You get cut off, right? When no one really knows what that definition is. I'm not going to get into that right now. I'll have this whole Masechet Kritu we'll have time to talk about. Then, if you do that accidentally, you didn't realize, then you'll bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. If you didn't know if you did it or not, you bring what's called an asham tali. Okay, the classic case, we're going to see it coming up, is there was a piece of forbidden fat. Okay, there's forbidden fats, they're called chaylev. It's parts of the fats of the animal. When you bring a sacrifice, the chaylev, those fats are burned on the altar, and then there's permitted fats. They're not burnt on the altar. Now, because those are burnt on the altar, we're not talking about sacrifices though. In a sacrifice, they're burnt on the altar. When you eat a regular piece of meat, it's parallel to something you might bring on the altar, which is why, by the way, this is the way to remember it only applies to behemot, not chayot. Chayot are undomesticated animals, like a deer and things like that. They don't go on the altar, so the chaylev is not forbidden. Only behemot, sheep, cows, bulls, things like that, go on the altar. Their chaylev is forbidden when you eat that kind of meat. So let's say, right, you can imagine a piece of fat, it all looks the same. You don't know the difference. So you eat it thinking it's shuman, but it turns out it was chaylev. What if you eat it and you don't know? Someone says, I think there was chaylev on the table. I'm not sure, but I think there was chaylev and you might have eaten it. So we're going to see two different cases of that kind of safek. There's a big difference between the two. We'll get there in a minute. One is there's one piece and one is there's two pieces. We'll talk about it soon. And then you don't know. So what do? You bring what's called a provisional guilt offering. Asham talui. It takes care of your atonement in the meantime. Meaning, until you figure out, was it really chaylev that you ate? Now, you may never figure it out. So if you never figure it out, that asham talui carries you, it provides you with whatever atonement you might need, if you need atonement. But if you find out down the road that you actually ate chaylev, like you do your research and you eventually figure it out, that you really ate chaylev, then you actually have to bring a korban chatat, because then you really did the avera. Okay, the asham talui is when you're not really sure. So comes the second part of this braita. It seems to be Rabbi Akiva continuing. Likewise, we say, below, it could be Rabbi Akiva, it could be someone who was talking before Rabbi Akiva, because if you remember, the structure was, first they had this drasha, then they said Rabbi Akiva would cry about this, and he would say the following. Probably it's Rabbi Akiva continuing. That's the pasuk that refers to this. You don't know, right? So you have a sin, even though you don't know. What if you went to a restaurant thinking it was kosher? Okay, it had a ti'udah, said it was kosher, had supervision. But you didn't know that the guy who owned the place was sneaking in non-kosher meat and fed you non-kosher meat. Or it was an accident, somehow. Kigon, just like just like this case where you have a piece that's maybe it's fat, that's permitted, maybe it's chaylev, which is not permitted. And yet, Amar Krav and Asavo no, and you anyway have to bring a korban. You need atonement for that. Because, right, clearly in that case, even if you ate the chaylev, you didn't intend to eat the chaylev. You intended to eat kosher fat. You didn't know that it wasn't. So, Mishin is kaven, alop yado basar chazir, alav yado basar chazir, al acha kama v'kama. The end is going to be the same in all three cases. All the more so, one who actually intended to do a sin and actually doesn't. So case number one was you intended to sin and you didn't. Case number two is you didn't intend to sin and you did. Okay? And now we have Isi ben Yehuda. Isi ben Yehuda disagrees on one point with this case. He doesn't think that you bring an asham taloi in the case where there was one piece of fat and you just don't know, was it chaylev, was it shuman? Why? Because there might not even be isur there. So it's such a doubt that you don't even need to bring a sacrifice for. But he said the following, and according to, like I said, our girsa has the exact same pasuk. Some people say it's a different pasuk, but not so central to our point. Below yadav Hashem v'nasav no. Uma, what does he learn from this pasuk? Again, where you didn't know, but you have to bring a korban anyway. Uma mishin nitkaven. So first of all, he starts the same way as the second section we had just before. If nitkaven la'alo b'yado basar taleh, you go to this kosher restaurant thinking you're eating kosher meat. V'ala b'yado basar chazir. But kigon, the one he compares it to is different. Like, for instance, it would have to be in a way where it was a little different than the way I described it. There were two pieces of fat in front of you. One was forbidden, one was permitted. And then you're not sure which one you ate. So what's the difference? The difference is in the previous case, we're not even sure that there was forbidden fats there. There was one piece. It was 50-50 chance that it was forbidden fats. In this case, the fats were there, the forbidden fats. It's just we don't know if you ate it or not. So it's different when there's definite isser before you, as opposed to when there wasn't definite isser. So he doesn't think that previous case would actually require you to bring a sacrifice. In this case, where there's definite forbidden item before you, it's just a matter, did you eat it or not? That's a different story. V'nasavo no. And then you have to, you're right, again, you're responsible in this case, even though you clearly didn't intend anything wrong. Therefore, again, we're going to know this already. Okay, so all the more so, someone who sins intentionally, okay, has the intent and actually goes ahead with it. So here we're talking about three cases of, again, two are very similar. It's just a matter of one piece or two pieces, but they're basically getting at the idea that you didn't have any intent, but you actually did something wrong. And the other is you had intent to do something wrong, but you didn't actually do anything wrong. And if those two both need atonement, or those three, depending on, right, how you hold, then all the more so someone who sins intentionally. And on this people should be very upset about, right? This is showing how much atonement is needed in our communities. So now the Gemara wants to know, why did you need to bring all three cases? So now they're going to say, what's unique about each case? You need them all. Why? If you had the case of the woman, our famous woman, right, who thinks she's sinning, but she's really not, you would say, you might claim, now we're going to claim everything in its opposite, but you might claim she needs more atonement because she actually had intent to sin. But in the other two cases, where you weren't, or at least in case 2, but obviously in case 3 also, but they're just comparing right now case 1 and 2, where you're not sure if it was even asur, and you certainly had no intent to eat anything forbidden. You might have thought you don't even need atonement there because you had no intent to do anything wrong. Let's say you had that one. You would say, well, there's actually something wrong. There's something forbidden, right? We don't know, but at least there's a 50-50 chance that there's something that you may ate something wrong and done a sin. But you might have said, this woman didn't do anything wrong. It's true she intended, but in the end, she didn't do anything wrong. So maybe you would have thought she doesn't need atonement. What if you had case 1 and 2? Now, if you've been learning in the skills class about the accidental murderer, this is exactly the play that we had there. Because what are they going to say right now? You might have thought, right, where we've talked about Ir Miklat, the refuge city, is both a punishment, but it also protects you. And if you go closer to intentional, you maybe don't get that protection and really atonement, which is the issue here. The being in the refuge city atones for your sin. If you're worse, that you're closer to intentional, you don't deserve atonement. So that's what they're going to suggest here. You might have thought those first 2, you can get atonement for them because here you intended, but you didn't actually do anything wrong. And in the other one, you don't even know if you did anything wrong. And that's, okay, now also the other one, but to lo ik be'isura. In the Nazir case, there is no isur. It's permitted. And in the second case, we don't even know for sure. It's only 50-50 that there even was chelev in front of you. But you might then say, but when you have the isur right in front of you and you ate one of them, well, the ikba isura, where the isur is right there, this is, by the way, like kol kavua kemechzal mechtadami, when we have spekot, if it's in front, right, if it's in its place, then we're more strict about it. Lo sagele b'kapara uslicha, it might not be enough to just bring a korban. That might not do it for you. You might need more atonement than that. Therefore, you needed all 3 cases to teach you that it doesn't really make a difference. Okay, so section 1 of our daf, with these 3 braitot that all took our Mishnah, the case in our Mishnah, and first of all, strengthened Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, which, by the way, you can see why they assume that Rabbi Yehuda is explaining Tanna Kama, because nobody really seems to disagree with this. And it shows the importance of, right, again, having intent without action or action without intent, both need atonement. Along the issues of intent, now we're going to talk about the ways of God are straight, the righteous ones will walk in the path of them, and the evil people will fall and stumble on them. Now, this seems to be saying that, or the transgressors, thank you. This seems to be saying that 2 people can do the exact same thing, but for one, it's a sin, and the other, it's a good deed. So what is this? So Rabbi Barbar is quoting Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have Reish Lakish. We can bring a different example. And then the Gemara is going to knock out Reish Lakish's and bring a different explanation instead. Mashal shnei bnei Adam. So Rabbi Yochanan says there's a mashal here for the parable is there's 2 people. They both roasted their korban pesach. But one ate it for the purposes of doing a mitzvah. The difficult term to explain because usually it means one thing, which is it usually means that you're already full and you ate beyond being full, and that's disgusting, and it's not even considered food to the extent that you could be exempt on Yom Kippur for eating achila gasa. It's not called eating. This can't be the explanation here because Reish Lakish is going to reject it and say the one who did achila gasa also did the mitzvah. So it's going to be hard to say how he thinks that when achila gasa means that. So most people say it's just you weren't really hungry and you didn't really care about eating it and you just kind of ate it without any real interest in eating or something like that. So right. So if you do it l'shem mitzvah, it's a mitzvah. If you do it without real intent at all, it's a sin. To which Reish Lakish says, what are you talking about? Reish Lakish, hi, Rashak, you're calling him a transgressor, a bad person? What do you mean? He might not have done the mitzvah in the best way possible, but Pesach miyaka'avi, but he actually ate his Pesach. I'm just going to point out, because we don't have time for this, but Reish Lakish, because the obvious parallel sugya to this, or mirror image sugya, is mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Do you need kavanah for a mitzvah or not? Reish Lakish says you need kavanah for a mitzvah, which is very strange, because here he seems to say you don't need kavanah. If you're doing it for just achilah gasa, you're obviously yotzei the mitzvah. I'm putting that question aside, but you should just think about it. If we had time, we would go more in depth into this, because it's fascinating daf from start to finish. So now he says that can't possibly be. Ella, I'm going to bring my example. Mashal l'shnei bnei adam, ze ishto v'achoto imo, v'ze ishto v'achoto imo. Two men go to their house, and each one has their wife and their sister in the house. Lezen is damnalo ishto, ulezen is damnalo achoto. They both go to bed, have relations with one of the people in their house. One ends up sleeping with his sister, one ends up sleeping with his mother. That's the example of they both do the same thing. They both have an act of sexual relations, but one is forbidden and one is permitted. To which the Gemara said, right? So again, Zeshin is namnalu ishto, the one who ended up, his wife was there. Oh, did I say mother? Sorry. Wife and sister. My confusion, if I said it wrong. Wife and sister. So the one who was with the wife, obviously, Sadikim Yechuban. That's great. He fulfilled his mitzvah of ona, of having relations with his wife. Zeshin is namnalu achoto, the one who ended up with his sister, upushlim yakashlupam. Right? They will basically stumble. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Midami, that's not what we're discussing here. We're talking about one act. You're talking about two totally different acts. The acts, it's not having relations with someone is one act. Having relations with your wife and having relations with your sister are two totally different things. You can't say that's the same path. Okay, that didn't work. They're going to come up with a very creative example. In the story of Lot, what happens, right? After Sodom was destroyed, the daughters say, oh my God, there's no future. We have to sleep with our father. What are we going to do? We're going to get him drunk. The older one goes the first night, gets him drunk, sleeps with him. The second one goes the next night, gets him drunk, and sleeps with him. Now, the intent here is, so here we have a much better example. Exact same act, but they did it with the intent for a mitzvah, to populate the world. They thought it was the end of the world. But he intended to have an act of znut with his daughters, or maybe he didn't realize it was his daughters, but it was totally an act of prostitution, and, or however you would call it. And he is, for him, it's a bad deed. Now they're going to question, is that really what's going on here? How do we know that he intended, that he didn't intend for the mitzvah also? Maybe he did. Okay, the next question is going to be, wasn't he drunk and not even knowing what he was doing? But first we're going to question, wasn't he doing a l'shem mitzvah? Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now what they're going to do is they're going to quote. Now I want you to have a sense of the psukim. This whole chapter with his daughters happens in chapter 19. Way back before in chapter 13, when Lot is still living with Abraham, and he splits with him, if you remember, his shepherds were fighting with Abraham's shepherds, and then they basically split. So when they split, there's this pasuk, and they're going to show basically how that pasuk, basically by splitting with Abraham, that caused his downfall. And this one pasuk describes that he was engaged in licentious behavior. Okay. So now this pasuk, when he splits with Abraham, it says, I'll read you the whole pasuk first. Vayisa Lot et einav, he picks up his eyes. Vayar et kol kikat Yarden, he sees the whole Jordan area. Ki kulam mashkel lifnei shachat Hashem et Sodom v'Amorah. It was all good land before God destroyed Sodom and Amorah. Ki gan Hashem ke'eretz Mitzrayim bo'achat tzor. Okay, it was like the land of Egypt. It was this great land. And then he basically says, that's where I want to go. So they basically, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, kol pasuk hazeh al shem aveira ne'ema. This entire pasuk is basically showing that he was engaged in bad licentious behavior. Vayisa Lot. They're going to take all the words in the beginning part of the pasuk and say they all appear in other places as someone engaged in some inappropriate behavior. Vayisa Lot. So he looks up. Where do we see this? V'tisa eshet adonav et eineha. This is Eshet Potiphar. Potiphar's wife looks up, sees Yosef, and decides to go for the kill. Et einav, he picks up his eyes. Ki hi yashra be'enai. By Shimshon, when he sees Delilah and he falls in love with her, who was a Philistine woman, and his parents are very upset with him, it says, Hi yashra be'enai. It was his eyes that saw her and liked her, the eyes that caused Lot to go look at other women. Vayal, he looked. Who else looked? Vayal otah Shechem ben Chamor. Shechem ben Chamor looked and saw Dinah, also obviously not the best, right? He rapes her. Et kol kikat hayarden, the kikar hayarden. Kikar is like the square, or the, right? But what does it mean here? They're going to take kikar as like a loaf of bread. Where does a loaf of bread appear having to do with sexual behavior? Or prostitution. Ki ba'ad isha zona ad kikar lechem. Okay, this is a pasuk from Mishlei, which basically says people who go after prostitutes will be left with not even enough money to buy a loaf of bread. So they take the kikar and they say, oh, look, this appears, right? They're obviously, this is drasha world, right? This obviously isn't what the pasuk was referring to. The simple reading. And one more word, one more phrase, kikula mashke, because it was all mashke, which literally means drinks, right? So it meant like good land with the moisture. But they now quote a pasuk in Hosea, which is talking about a prostitute. I will go, this is about the Jewish people. They'll say, I go after my beloved. They give me bread and water. He gives me wool and linen. Shamni v'shiku yai. Gives me my oil and my drinks. So here you see drinks connected with her beloved, and she's a prostitute. So here you see the same word used. Okay, so if you weren't convinced that Lot did this intentionally and he was engaged in licentious behavior, here's your proof. Again, it's not in that parak. That's what I wanted you to notice. And it's not certainly the simple reading of that pasuk. But what it is showing also, which we're going to see later, is that that was the pivotal moment in Lot's life where he kind of goes wayward. And really, we're going to see soon that his sin was splitting from Avraham. Okay, and that kind of caused all these problems. To which they then say, now obviously I see you're saying, of course these words are used in other, this is the world of drasha. If you want to prove something, you can, but you can also prove the opposite. But wasn't he forced into this? I mean, they raped him basically. He was sleeping, he was drunk, he wasn't aware of what was going on. So how could you say it was a rasha doing terrible things? This is a very interesting thing. There's a few places in the Torah where there's dots above letters. In this case, in this pasuk, it says the older one slept with him, and then it says lo yada v'shocha uvkuma. He didn't know when she went to sleep with him, and he didn't know when she came off of him. Okay, when she got up. So it sounds like he had no idea what was going on, which is why the Gemara said it wasn't his fault. But there's a dot on that middle vav in the word uvkuma, and because of that dot, they darshan that what's it coming to tell you? It's not exactly true. And whether you take this as he was totally aware, some of the commentaries say he was somewhat aware and, mildly aware. So they say, so there's a nakud avav kumasha b'chira, lomar, right, when the older one went, lomar sheb'shichva lo yada b'kuma yada. He knew when she got up. To which the Gemara says, okay, well, that doesn't help. What can you do at that point? It was too late. She had already slept with him. So again, he might have known, but it was too late by the time he knew. But the next night, he shouldn't have drunk wine again. In other words, remember, it happened 2 nights in a row. So he should have been aware for the second daughter not to get drunk again, because he realized at the end what was going on. So now we've proven Lot was responsible. The daughters had good intents. He had bad intents. And therefore, in the end, that's a good example of Tzadikim el Chubam, the same exact action. And here it's really interesting because it's really the same action. They're even doing the action together, but one person could be meaning one thing and one person could be meaning the other. And for one, it's looked at as a good deed and the other, it's a bad deed. Now, Bnot Lot don't get the greatest rap either. And we're even going to talk about them a little more later in the daf. But at least in this sense, we're saying that they did this l'shem shamayim, okay, for the right reasons. So again, we had the 3 braita, right? The 3 sections of the braita, which talked about either intent without action or action without intent, and still you need kapara. Then we talked about how important intent is, that intent could change an action entirely. You could do the same thing, but with the right intent, it's good. With the wrong intent, it's bad. Darish Rava, if we're already on Lot, and this is where you're going to see that the split from Abraham was where it all happened. It's probably why they're talking about this now, because that pasuk is where he split. That's another pasuk from Mishlei. A brother who goes wayward from a stronghold, okay, which they're going to say is Lot leaving Avraham. Okay, Lot is the brother who goes wayward. Avraham is the strong pillar. Midyanim kivereach armon. Midyanim in Mishlei all the time. It's not the Midianites. It's Midyanim. Madon is fighting. Fighting is like a sealed palace. Meaning what? Ach nifsham kiryat oz zelot sheperesh me'Avraham. It was Lot who separated from Avraham. Midyanim kivereach armon. Shehitil Midyanim, because he caused fighting. That was the whole idea. We're now at the top of Amud Bet. They caused this fighting between the two of them, right? Even as there were the Ro'im, his shepherds were fighting with his shepherds. And then what happens? Kivrechim va'armon. It basically causes the door to get locked. What happened? Lot could have lived very peacefully with Abraham, but what happened? He split. And after he split, right, because of the fighting caused the door to be sealed. Because what happens in the end? Lo yavo Amoni and Moab b'kal Hashem. Who are the two sons born from the two daughters of Lot and with Lot? Amon and Moab. So what happens in the end? They get closed out, locked out of becoming back to the Jewish people. They can't marry in. They're not allowed. So again, obviously, what are you thinking? Ruth, Moaviyah, right? The women, yes. And we will get to Ruth today, so have no fear. Of course, she's going to come up in the context of this discussion. And even we'll get to Naamah Ammonit, who marries Rechavam a few generations later. So we're going to end today. But the males can never come back in. So here you see where they're basically blaming Lot for the split, right? That's why I think they took that pasuk and they said that's when Lot went wayward, because by splitting with Abraham, that kind of sealed his fate and sent him on a bad way. And more psukim about Lot. Okay, so if you're running after your ta'avot, you often want to be separated from other people. And any wise advice that you get that's tushia yitgala, you will snarl at and just say, no, thank you. L'ta'ava yivakesh nifrad zelot. That was Lot, who again split, separated from Abraham. Here they darshan, this is the world of drashot. Instead of the ayin yitgala, which would mean to snarl at, they say yitgala with a hey, which will be revealed. Shenitgala klono b'batei knesot u'batei midrashot. This is a great line. All the things he did wrong and how bad he was, his embarrassment, is paraded about or declared all the time in the shuls and in the batei midrash. Now, what goes on in the shuls? We read the Torah, shebechtav. What goes on in the Beit Midrash? The oral Torah. So here they say, right, in the shuls, they read, Lo yavo Amoni and Moavi b'kal Hashem. So all the time we're hearing Lot, oh, look how bad he went. His sons can't marry in. And we're in the Batei Midrashot, it's not. Amoni and Moavi asurim v'isuran isur olam. The rabbis darshan, that not only are they forbidden, but forever, right? Not like 10th generation or 3rd generation, right? There's some that, so right, there's the Mitzri can come 3rd generation, and the Edomi, but not Amoni and Moab, they can't come forever. Amar Ula. Okay, now we're back to, so this was again, talking about Lot and where really he went wrong by splitting from Abraham. Now we're back to, and again, an action, this is interesting, because splitting from Abraham doesn't seem like a terrible sin, but basically they're saying, because of what it came with and what he was trying to get away from, that kind of sealed his fate, put him on that path. Amar Ula, back to same action, totally different intent, and totally different results. Tamar zinta, Zimri zina. Okay, Tamar, Yehuda, right? She saw Yehuda wasn't marrying her off to the next brother, which she was supposed to, and she basically took the actions into her own hand, dressed up as a prostitute, got Yehuda to sleep with her. Zimri was with Cosby and Zimri, and he basically gets up and starts doing znut with the Benot, with the Benot Moab, and basically, right, Pinchas comes and stabs him. So you have two people who are engaged in licentious behavior. Tamar zinta yatzu mimena melachim u'nevi'im. Kings and prophets came from her. Zimri zina naflu alav kama revavot miYisrael. He sins, 24,000 Jews die. So you see again, same action, but your intent is all that matters. Since we're talking about intent, the obvious sugya we're going to bring up now is Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Gedola avera lishma mi mitzvah shelo lishma. We can't avoid mitzvah here, okay? So now we're going to talk about if you do an avera for the sake of heaven, okay, like Tamar, let's say, is greater than, interesting, a mitzvah shelo lishma. You could do a mitzvah without doing it for the sake of heaven, you're better off doing an avera shelo lishma. Lishma, sorry, an avera for the sake of heaven. To which the Gemara says, really? What do you mean? Famous line, you should always do Torah and mitzvot, even if you don't do it for the right reasons. Because you might start off doing it for the wrong reasons or not for the right reasons, but eventually it'll just become a part of you, right? We use this all the time. We talk about chinuch of children, right? Just, make them go to shul. They'll love going to shul, right? It doesn't always work, but right, it's part of the idea. Eventually it'll work. So how could you possibly say an avera lishma is better? To which they say, okay, fine. We'll put them on the same level. Okay, you can have an avera for the sake of heaven, which is just like a mitzvah shelo lishma, because obviously it's still an avera. Okay, so they put them on the same level. Where do we prove this from? And what this proves is a good question. Does it prove that they're equal, or does it just prove that there's value to avera lishma? You'll see in a minute what the problem is to say that this is proving that they're equal. Dichti tivorach minashim Yael eshet chever hakeni minashim ba'ol tivorach. Okay, this is in Shirat Torah. Okay, the story of, if you remember the story of Dvorah, in the end, it's Yael who wins the war. Remember, Dvorah goes to Barak, and Barak doesn't want to go, and she says, you're going to go, but the glory is going to be not in your hands. In the end, it's Yael who basically gets the head of the army to drink some warm milk with her. He falls asleep, and the legend goes, right, from the words, we're going to see them inside in Devorah. It doesn't actually say it in the text, but in the song of Devorah, it says, Kara, Shachav, Nafal. It says, basically, it sounds like some sexual encounter happened there, and she basically saves the Jewish people because then she kills him, right? She sticks when she does that, he's really out, and then she kills him. So now, it says here, she will be tivorach minashim, okay, she'll be blessed from women, minashim ba'ol tivorach, like the women in the tents. Now, who are the women in the tents? Man nashim sheba'ol sarav litkava chevaleah. Tents always has a connotation, and this is also why they could say this, but always has this connotation of sexual relations in the tent. So now, what's the comparison? She had relations with Sisra for the purposes of saving the Jewish people. They, when they have relations with their husband, if we say it's teaching you, it's like mitzvah shelo lishma, sounds like they have relations with their husbands, not for the sake of heaven. So how could you possibly say that? It's very weird. So either it's just not saying that at all. It's just trying to show she was on the level of the mothers, and that just shows avera lishma is very important. Or some people claim, well, they enjoyed it, and therefore it wasn't only for the sake of doing the mitzvah, it also had personal enjoyment, which is the topic that's going to come up in one more second. And maybe that's why. There's some other answers given, but we'll leave that as an open question right now. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Sheva be'ilot ba'al oto rasha ba'ota sha'a. Okay, here we see, here's the drasha that says, he slept with her 7 times, Shane'emar, ben raglea kara nafal shacha v'gomer. They read that whole pasuk, there's more to it, I'm not going to go into it because there's such an interesting daf and it's not so fascinating, but they basically say there are 7 action items in that pasuk. So that means 7 times. But didn't she enjoy having relations with him? Now you're thinking, what? Okay, which is what the Gemara is going to say. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and then basically, how could you say it was lishma? Maybe she was enjoying it. And that's why some of the commentaries put the enjoyment issue back to the mothers before, the matriarchs. Anyway, when something's good for a rasha, and someone else is on the other side and they're a good person, it's obviously bad for them. Okay, which you can imagine as a woman, right? It obviously was not pleasurable for her. So now they say, Shane'emar, Hishamer lecha midaber im Yaakov mitov ad ra. Right, this is said to Lavan, do not speak to Yaakov mitov ad ra. Now, Bishlam ra, we understand, don't speak bad to Yaakov, Shapir. Okay, we get that. Ela tova, Milo, why can't he speak good things to Yaakov? Right? You can imagine Lavan. We always think of him as such a trickster. Anytime you say something nice, it doesn't really mean nice, right? It's always some underhanded something to it. So even when a Rasha speaks nicely about you, it's not. Some people say it's that he always talked about Avodah Zarah, like good was him, had to do with idols. And then it made Yaakov cringe to hear about the idols, maybe. Okay, there's all sorts of ways you can understand that. But the point being the obvious point, which is Yael did not enjoy having sex with Sisra. Gufa. Okay, now we're going to go back because they can't ignore this line. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav L'olam Ya'asok Adam Torah V'Mitzvot Afilu Shelo Lishman Shmitoch Shelo Lishman Ba'Lishman. Okay, so back to this great line about always the importance of doing mitzvot even if you're not doing them for the right reasons. So now they say Shebischal membet korbanot, because of the reward of the 42 sacrifices she kriv balak harasha, zachav yatzami menu root. Interesting. We get to root from a different direction, not where you were expecting. We were talking about root from Amon and Moab and from those daughters who made that happen. And from, right, and then Tamar also, right? We get to root in so many different ways, in so many complicated ways. Now they're going to say balak harasha was one of the ancestors of Ruth. And because he did something that he did for the wrong reasons, but he brought these 42 sacrifices in order to be able to curse the Jewish people, he ended up being rewarded because he did bring 42 sacrifices to God. He ends up being rewarded. How do we know this? Because I'm Rabbi Yehuda. She was from Eglon. Eglon appears in the beginning of Sefer Shoftim with Ehud ben Gera, kills him. He's that very fat, and then it was in the room alone with him. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the whole story, but he was from Balak, who was the king of Moab, and he was the king of Moab, and she apparently came from him. He gets rewarded for some small thing he did. Okay. Amal Rabbi Chia Bar. Okay. Just to go back, I saw someone write in the chat, and I just want to address this, right? This thing about the mothers and the not enjoy, their enjoyment means they enjoy for the mitzvah. It's a side point. I'm not sure that we really take that too seriously, and that means what? You can't enjoy it. I don't think there's any sort of element of that going on. But anyway, well, like I said, it's sort of, they're kind of stuck to figure out how the Gemara works, and they're then pushed into a corner to kind of say something. I wouldn't take it too strongly in terms of, is that really, the way we're supposed to view it? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're back to Lot's daughters. Okay, we're a little bit zigzagging today. Okay, again, let's just go quickly before we get to the end of the stuff. We had the three stories, right? The three braitot, the three examples, with kavanah, without maaseh, with maaseh, without kavanah. Then we had this pasuk that you could do the same action with different intent, all about the issue of intent. We tried to bring a bunch of examples. We ended up really bringing the example of Lot. That's the only one that doesn't get knocked out. Lot and his two daughters. From there, we got all about Lot and how he separated from Avram. Then we get back to this idea of intent and how you can even do a avera if your intent is for God. That already is considered a great thing. And from there, we talked about Yael and Sisra. Now we're back to, and then we talked about how it compares to mitzvah shelo lishma, and then we talk about mitzvah shelo lishma because we don't want to not deal with that topic. Now we're going to go back into the daughters of Lot for a minute. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Minayin she'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekapech afilu schar sichana. Here's again, if we're talking about mitzvah shelo lishma, we're also going to talk about reward that you get for some, right? You can get rewarded for an avera lishma, basically, we said. You do an avera for the sake of God. You do a mitzvah not for the sake of God, you can even get rewarded. And then there's even some small little thing that you said something in the right way, you could get a reward for. What is this? Well, we're going to learn this from Lot's daughters. Ilu bechira, the older one, dekrite Moab, she called him Moab, which is very obnoxious way to call her son. Me'ab, you're from my father, and it's parading her actions everywhere. Amrle Rachmana, so the Torah said, Al tatzeret Moab, al tidgar b'milchama. Don't put a siege on Moab, and don't start war with them. But what doesn't it say? It doesn't say don't start up with them in general. Just don't start a war. But you can make them suffer. But Ilu, they're basically comparing two psukim, one about Ammon, one about Moab, and they say it in a different language. Ilu tzira, but the younger one, dekrite ben ami. Ben ami is a much more, one of my nation. That's much more not clear what she really meant, even though it does indicate she came from, right, the child came from within my nation, but it's much less blatant. Amar le, there it says, al titzuleim va'al tidgarbam. Don't bother them at all, it said, right? Don't siege them and don't bother them. Sounds like don't bother them at all, not only for war, but anything. Afilu tziure lo tzarin klas. You can't even bother them at all. That means like starting up with them, causing them to suffer. Last line for today. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. Another thing we learned from the daughters of Lot. La'olam yakdim adam lidvar mitzvah. Now we're going to look at something good that the older one did. You should always try to be the first to do the mitzvah. Why? Because of, interesting, they even turn this into a mitzvah, right? They call it a mitzvah, what they did, which again, that's how we started. But in the later words of the Gemara, you might call it an avera lishma, right? A sin for the sake of good. But anyway, for the reward of the one night, right? She slept with her father first. She did it the first night. The next one did it the next night. look at what her reward was. I told you we get back to Naamah Ammonit. So there's Naamah Ammonit who marries Rechavam, but Ruth comes in much earlier and ends up having 4 generations of leaders, Ovad, Ishai, David, and Shlomo, before Naamah Ammonit comes on the scene. So basically, she was rewarded by having it much, much earlier just because of that one night. Okay, so that ends our sugya, ends to the next Mishnah, our fascinating, fascinating topic about intent when it comes to Averot, a little bit of intent when it comes to mitzvot, and how to do the same action, it means something totally different. How even if you intended to do a sin, but you didn't, you still need atonement. How if you didn't do a sin, if you're not sure if you did a sin, but maybe did it, you need atonement, right? And all these different issues that kind of come together in our sugya. Wishing everybody a great day and a lot of food for thought from today.